this is a little bit of a different format than what I'm used to, which is kind of usually more of almost like a lecture type presentation with some question and answer. But it was suggested that we follow the LePage Center here at Villanova has kind of this sort of more open-ended format where I would sort of play the role of moderator of the discussion. And I've got a list of questions to start conversation rolling. But this is definitely something we want to encourage people to pose your questions from the audience to our assembled panel of experts, as it were, here. So, but before we get into that, I do want to give you a brief introduction to our guests that we have assembled here today. First, like I said, as Father Joe said, my name is Mark Schrod. I'm associate professor in the political science department. I do a lot of international relations, comparative politics, with a regional focus on Russia in the former Soviet Union. And just a quick history of how this panel idea came about. Obviously, Russia is in the news a lot these days, especially when it comes to the topic of cybersecurity, internet politics, not only dealing with the election that we had in Russia just over the weekend, but obviously when it comes to things like questions of collusion, election meddling in the United States. And so I thought it would be great to have a presentation, have a panel on this very timely topic. And when it came to people that I really wanted to see come to campus, there were two people who really stuck out to me. Well, one is Sean Guillory here, who's over at the University of Pittsburgh. He has a PhD in history from UCLA. He runs Sean's Russia blog and the podcast associated with that. And I've gotten to know him initially online, so internet politics there as well, and have really come to respect him as somebody that's sort of my go-to person when it comes to, when people come and ask me questions that I have no idea about. Sean's usually already written an entire treatise about it in some manner or form.
Exaggerate.
So it was great that he is able to join us from the University of Pittsburgh. And also Kevin Rothrock here also got to know online for the most part back when you were, I think first came across my radar when you were at the Moscow Times as editor there. And it's kind of bounced around RUNet Echo, and now it's at Meduza.io, which is, it seems that you spent, and maybe I'm misconstruing this, it seems that you spend a lot of your time sort of scouring the Russian internet and finding interesting things that are newsworthy for English-speaking and American audiences. And again, another person I find myself deferring to all the time and finding really interesting things about Russia and internet politics. And so thank you both for coming. And then the third member of our panel is Hank Carter. Hank has a PhD from Georgia Tech. He's in our assistant professor in our computer sciences department. And when it came to sort of thinking about these issues that are very timely in international politics today, we sort of came to the realization that we know a lot about Russia, we know a lot about international relations. We don't know jack squat about when it comes to hacking elections or internet security or cybersecurity. And so Hank has that expertise right here at Villanova, and so we're extremely grateful that he was able to join us on this panel and offer his expertise as well. So these are your panelists. I'm just kind of here in a role as moderator. And before we sort of open things up to more general questions from the audience and see where this discussion takes us, I assume that there's a lot of interest in the Russian election, or not the Russian election, but the Russian intervention in the American election. So I thought first maybe to get to that more timely topic of the election that just happened over the weekend. If you haven't been watching the news, Vladimir Putin won re-election in something of a landslide with 70% of, or I guess 76% of the votes, with upwards of 70% turnout. And so I guess I was curious, maybe sort of an open question for some of our panelists. What does this mean? Does this mean anything for Russia, or is this sort of more business as usual going forward for the Putin regime? Or is this, what is the role of this election that the spectacle that we saw in Russia over the weekend? Do we have any takers?
Would you like to? Well, I mean, ultimately, I think it's more of the same. I mean, it is literally more of the same in the obvious respect. And then, in terms of the way the election actually took place, you had, I think, the final turnout, the official final turnout was 67%. The reported target by the Kremlin was 70%. So they pretty much got that. And then Putin's final tally was, I think, 76 or 77%. So they exceeded the 70% mark they were looking for there. And so basically, the government got what they wanted. And so there's not, and that's not a surprise. But so in that regard, okay. I mean, it doesn't really leave us anywhere new. And then the other thing that was occurring sort of outside establishment politics were these various efforts to field election observers, and there were some noted cases of physical violence actually in Dagestan, I believe. And Navalny's campaign, Alexei Navalny, famously sent several monitors to Chechnya, where at the polling stations where they were doing observing work, they noted relatively low or regular, I guess you could say, turnout levels, but nonetheless the Republic's final turnout tally was something like 91 or 92%. So again, this is kind of more of the same. It's isolated cases of monitors being denied access to the polling stations or to the urns, as they're called, the boxes where they drop all the votes in. And by not getting access, the presumption is that somebody, when you're not looking, is stuffing in lots of ballots illegitimately. And the other thing to note is that I'm not a statistician, but there's this fairly renowned, I think he's a physicist, something Spielkin or something like this. He's every election for the last few cycles, he put out Gaussian curves of the turnout and the support data to show essentially where there are not normal distributions of votes that would suggest that there is tampering with the votes. And his finding was that between 8 and 10 million votes had been stuffed in favor of Putin. And so that sounds pretty bad, right? But Putin got several dozens of millions of votes. And this was actually, according to his estimates, one of the lower examples of voter falsification in the last several presidential cycles, and maybe even including parliamentary election cycles as well. So, numerically, it sounds like, oh my gosh, what a travesty of democracy. But relatively speaking, maybe a little bit more honest than one's accustomed to seeing.
And just for reference, I did
Oh,
have
there
a
you
slide
go.
of the distributions there.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
And so you have a nice, I guess, illustration of these. And one thing that's worthy of note, I guess, to follow up on that, is that if you look at these distributions of turnout and sort of the support for Putin in these cases, you'll notice on the very right-hand tail a lot of noise, a lot of little spikes at the end. And that's usually a telltale indicator of voting irregularities driven by individuals who are told that they need to have a certain percentage of output. And so those, you can see a spike right around 80% output, or 80% turnout, I should say, 85% turnout, 90% turnout. And so these nice round numbers is where you have those spikes. And that's not something that is a normal distribution.
There were, I believe, 6 federal subjects in Sunday's election where Putin won more than 90% of the vote. I think they are Dagestan, Chechnya, Kabardino-Balkaria, I think, and then Crimea, Sevastopol, which are separate federal subjects, and also the Tuva region. And so you've got, the north. The Tuva is apparently also well known for having high Putin support / probably falsified votes and so on. And then the North Caucasus is notorious for doing this. And then, of course, Crimea was treated as I guess the one thing to note about this election, which is different from the others, is that people in Crimea voted for Russian president at this time, not through the embassy or whatever, but through local polling stations, because this is the first time that the presidential election took place after the annexation, and Putin won. I think the turnout was something like I want to say the high 80s. I could be wrong there, but it was 10% lower than it was for the referendum, and Putin won something like 91, 92%, and that was just a few percentage points lower than Crimeans voted yes in the secession referendum, officially or whatever. So it was billed as sort of a second referendum, and similar results.
In terms of what the election means, I mean, Kevin's right in the sense that it's more of the same. But it's at the same time, this election was different than past elections in the sense of its meaning. Because before, Putin could run in his 2004 re-election, he could run on, basically restoring a high standard of living, increase of incomes, rebuilding or modernizing Russia. There was high oil prices, the economy was booming. And then in 2008, he hands it over to Dmitry Medvedev, his handpicked anointed successor. And then when he ran for his third term in 2012, he was able to pit himself against the street demonstrations that were occurring against the falsification of parliamentary elections in December 2011. So that created actually a lot, at least the 2012 election, created somewhat of a political tension in the sense that Putin is running against, the protests. But this time around, the problem came up is, well, what is this election about? Because the Kremlin doesn't seem to be really offering, say, what the future will hold for you as a Russian citizen. We are not really saying, behind some, empty platitudes about improving the economy, improving the standard of living, increasing wages. There's all of this rhetoric, but there was this similar rhetoric in 2012. So really all the Kremlin had to offer was, or Putin had to offer, was himself. So then the problem became, well, if we're going to have to go through this election, how do we make it interesting enough to make it essentially a referendum on the status quo, which is Putin? And therefore, this time, it was interesting to me, looking at a lot of the discourse around the election, it actually had nothing to do with getting the vote out for Putin in the sense of making sure he won, because nobody ever questioned that. In fact, this election, he got 56 million votes, more than any other presidential election, at least since 2000. And so the drive, the real emphasis was on turnout. And there were, posters plastered all from what I've been told in Moscow, all over the city to encourage people to turn out. There was a lot of things to encourage or influence or at least, suggest, coerce that people go out and vote. And a lot of that is similar types of practices that they've used before in terms of busing, allowing for free transportation or increasing public transportation in regional cities. In a lot of respects, a lot of the stuff they used to use in the Soviet period to get people to vote was reproduced in this election. And really what it is it was a referendum on Putin. Now, the question then is now that what happens next? And this is the big question everybody seems to have, and of course everybody has different speculation because that's all we could do, because by all intents and purposes, now this is the last term. In 6 years, Putin runs against the constitutional issue, in the sense that Russian presidents can't serve for more than 2 consecutive terms. And what he did last time in 2008 was essentially anoint a successor, become prime minister, and then he came back in 2012, 4 years later. Now it's a 6-year term, and there's different views about this. Is Putin going to look for a successor? Is there going to be the creation of another office of sorts, kind of a national leader of sorts, where he could slot in and still, basically run things in a certain capacity? Is he just going to stay on, change the constitution? So in many respects, the next couple of years in Russia is going to be quite interesting because in terms of the shuffling of what his government is and the various elites and pushing for who's going to either be a successor or how they're going to basically construct a way for Putin to continue past, 2024 now? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's what the significance is it's kind of a watershed of sorts into, well, okay, that was fine. You just had this big reality show for 3 months. Now what happens next?
And actually, the day after he won, he fielded a question from a reporter who asked him, will you run again in 2030? Because in 2024, he's ineligible because that would be 2 terms consecutive. And so the premise of the question was, you'll find another placeholder, maybe Medvedev again, and then in 2030, we're going to be talking about your return once more. What's your comment? And his answer was, what do you think, I'm going to stay here till I'm 100?
Yeah.
Which is, Putin likes making jokes like that, but at the same time, that's exactly the question many people are asking.
Any questions, I guess, from the audience in terms of specific to the 2018 elections, the ones that we just had over the weekend in Russia?
How easy would it be for Putin to amend the Constitution to keep this at this point?
It would be very easy. The issue is, and that's the issue with this election too, is he could do it easily. The problem is, how do you legitimize it? How do you make it look legitimate in the eyes of the Russian population? And I mean, I don't think they'll be able to finagle legitimacy internationally, but then again, I doubt they really care too much. But yeah, I think that's the main question, is how to do it to make it look legitimate.
Yeah, and bear in mind that they already changed it so that the presidential term is 6 years, not 4. And they even moved the date of the presidential election this last Sunday. It wasn't initially going to take place then. It was going to take place earlier, but they wanted it to coincide with the anniversary of the annexation of Crimea. And so actually the parties that were happening outside Red Square, in Manege Square, on Sunday, were technically to celebrate the annexation of Crimea. And then when enough of the vote returns were in, they brought Putin up, and he gave a victory speech. But that's like not technically why they were gathered there. So they could things that in probably Western countries would be very difficult to change. In Russia, you just change them, and if it's expedient, then it's not difficult. Because United Russia, which is not formally Putin's political party, but in reality it is, has a supermajority in the parliament and they don't have to go to the states or the components of the Russian Federation for approval of that. I don't think. I mean, that you could look that up in Wikipedia and figure out what's the actual process for amending the Constitution, but it's doable.
Does the Russian government admit the fact that there are obvious irregularities in the votes? Because there's multiple videos out there, people stuffing in those envelopes and whatnot. What do they have? What's their all that?
They nullified the results in 7 different polling stations, as far as I know. And the official line is, there are some irregularities, that's what you get when you're dealing with millions of people doing anything, but nothing that would have changed the official results, which it also seems pretty plausible.
Yeah. The thing about this election, at least from what was being said in the Russian media, based on anonymous Kremlin sources, was the Kremlin was pretty strong about tampering down on vote falsification, because they didn't want a repeat of 2011, and they wanted it to go as smooth, everything go as smoothly as possible. Now the thing about it is they had this 70-70 scenario, right? So that's usually a recipe for actual vote tampering, particularly local politicians who have to basically please the center, so they have to figure out how to get the vote out. But it seems that looks like they were able to accomplish this without the mass falsification that they say had in 2011.
I have a question over here.
Does this kind of triumph in this election and more centralization of power risk any friction with more autonomous regions like the Chechnya region in the future?
I mean, Chechnya is one of Putin's biggest cheerleaders.
Yeah.
I mean, Ramzan Kadyrov basically has a blank check to do what he wants, basically. And so in fact, when Putin, when Putin eventually leaves, that will be a dire day for Chechnya at least, and probably now for Dagestan too, because Dagestan for the last 2 months has been in the midst of this enormous police crackdown by federal agents, essentially arresting and detaining and charging local police officials with all kinds of different corruption offenses. And it's pretty big news, actually. It's important news. It's not necessarily being given the attention it deserves, but it's indicative of the fact that the leadership in these republics is very much dependent on sort of continuity in Moscow. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is very good news for them. And it would be inconceivable to imagine losing Putin, especially for someone like Kadyrov, who undoubtedly has enemies in Moscow, powerful enemies who don't move against him because he's under the sort of Putin umbrella, I guess. And there might be, I mean, Moscow has occasional friction with Tatarstan, which sort of maintains more independence than I think probably most places in Russia. And they have, cultural reasons for that as well. But I don't see this as like being the stick that breaks the back or whatever. I think that it'll be fine.
Yeah. I mean, Chechnya basically has the best of both worlds right now in the sense of they have de facto independence, right? And their independence is bankrolled by Moscow. So it's kind of ironic because that's kind of what they were looking for when they tried to separate in the 1990s. This is essentially what they have. So.
Any other questions here?
Would it be fair to say then, his opponents, Putin's opponents, they never stood a chance. They weren't really legitimate. They never would have they couldn't get through with all of his political cronyism. And is that fair to say? I mean, it was just they were going through the motions.
They could never win. It's more kind of subjective whether or not you consider them to have been phony, because you could still technically run in a race with the object of raising awareness or something like that, right? I mean, Jill Stein probably didn't think she was going to win, but she saw some merit in running, and that you could say that of if you want to be sympathetic to certain candidates, you could say something like that about someone like Ksenia Sobchak, who knew she wasn't going to win. She didn't get more than 2% of the electorate. But she wanted a seat at the table, at least during the campaign season. Yeah, look at that.
There we go.
She wanted to be on the debates and raise issues. She wanted to meet with Putin when she lost so that she could deliver a list of political prisoners, things like this. So if you think that that's the best you can do, then thanks, Ksenia, right? Yeah. Then there are others who I think are more cynical about having participated, and they're literally just another line on the ballot. Like, well, I mean, a lot of these people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Sergei Baburin and Maxim Sorokin, like,
and certainly Zhirinovsky.
well, Zhirinovsky's like he actually has some political weight, but yeah, he's not running to win, and he's not running to change anything either. But like these bottom two right characters, like I don't think most Russians don't have any idea who they are, and they were the first to call Putin and concede when like 1% of the votes had been counted, and they were just happy to be done with it. There are also sort of, I don't know, conspiracy theories, I guess you could say, although maybe they're not all that conspiratorial, that Ksenia Sobchak's interest in running didn't have so much to do with helping the body politic so much as it was about personally getting back in the good graces of sort of network television. She's a TV personality. And Alexei Navalny, who famously was not allowed to run, he confronted her on YouTube actually on the day of the election, and after she invited him to take part in her new political party and movement or whatever, he said on live YouTube stream or whatever that Ksenia came to his apartment just after deciding to run and confided in him, although I can't imagine why she would have done this, said that she'd been offered a ton of money to run. Now, she then later clarified, that was like the money that she was going to have available for her campaign, in which she was just trying to say that they were going to have resources to be heard. But it's quite possible that she just, wanted to be on TV again. Central, like network TV.
Yeah.
She does have access to Doj and some opposition-y stuff.
Right.
And she had a very brutal campaign, by the way.
It was awful.
Whatever like criticisms can be made of Ksenia Sobchak, that she's thin-skinned would not be one of them.
Yeah.
She went on. She appeared in the live, or I guess maybe they were taped, but she appeared in several debates with the candidates. Although Putin doesn't debate, he sends proxies, and so do some of the other candidates. It's kind of a funny tradition. But she so much abuse was hurled at her. In fact, Zhirinovsky, the guy, well, you can see him right there. He's a very colorful, obscene person, and he called her on live TV right to her face, screaming really angrily, a total whore, and many other worse things. And she actually famously threw water at his face. And then he started calling even more things, and the host tried to intercede, and it was a pretty nasty. She also left the penultimate debate in tears.
Yeah.
She literally walked off the stage because they were, being so cruel to her, and they would interrupt her. They wouldn't let her speak.
Yeah.
So it wasn't pretty. Yeah.
So it's pretty much name recognition. Is that what most of them were trying to get?
I mean, some of them it's just a habit, maybe. Zhirinovsky's done this many, many times.
Yeah. That's his fourth or sixth run.
Yeah. So.
I'd like to shift up, since we spent a little bit of time on that, and get to more of the topic of, I guess, the internet politics aspect, and probably the big issue that a lot of us are probably here for is discussing the allegations and suspicions of Russian collusion, either overt or covert, in the American elections. I also want to bring Hank into the discussion a little more, because this is one area that we don't know nearly as much about, at least in terms of our own backgrounds. But I wanted to start this off with a question for each member of our panel, maybe in order. And that is, just based on my own experience with Russia is just dominating the headlines in the United States. Everybody seems to assume, one thing or another about Russia, and there seems to be a lot of sort of anti-Russian hysteria, that there's, Putin under every bed kind of thing. And so the question I just kind of wanted to pose to each of you in turn, based upon your different areas of expertise, if you could take sort of the American public or the American electorate and tell them like one thing that you know from your background that that you really wish everybody knew about, either about Russia or about sort of the dynamics of intervention, that would help us get a little bit of a better sense of these headlines that are constantly roiling around us. What would that be? What would that thing that we need to know about your area of expertise? And I guess maybe if we started with Hank.
Sure. So I think one of the interesting things from the technological perspective is that we've sort of hit this fever pitch of headlines about Russia hacking, electrical systems, voting systems, social networks, all of these different things. But I think it's sort of interesting to recognize that this is not really a new phenomenon. It's something that's been going on for several years. I mean, there's documented evidence to speak to the electrical system hacking that was denounced very, very recently. There's evidence that they've been trying to do this thing at least back into 2011. And it's very likely that they've been trying to do it before that. So I would say if there's anything to sort of be aware of, it's that these guys have been doing this for a while and are pretty experienced at it. We've now seen, because we have social networks that are so popular now at disseminating information, and that's the main conduit that a lot of people sort of take in news. I think that it had a pretty severe impact more recently, but it's something that they've been doing for a long time.
So the question is, what from my experience or expertise would I wish to impart on the American public?
Right. If you had to shake some sense into to the Joe on the street about Russian hysterics, what would it be?
Well, I mean, this might not be the thing that Americans desperately need to hear, but the thing I would most like to tell them, I suppose, is that this maybe, I don't know if this sidesteps the hacking question, but in terms of Russian media, and the two are related because there's a lot of panic in the United States about Russian propaganda and its influence on American thinking and on world order and so on. And sort of setting aside things like RT and Sputnik and Moscow's messaging and so on, I would just want to emphasize that Russia has a very vibrant media culture, both in terms of just people on social media, internet users, and also professional journalists producing amazing reporting. In fact, the reason we know so much about the troll factory and the Russian mercenaries working in Syria and the Russian volunteers in eastern Ukraine is not exclusively, but is largely based on investigative reporting by Russian reporters. And yeah, it's hard to do investigative reporting anywhere, but it is especially hard to do it in Russia. And if you do, the hallmark of the greatest kind of investigative work is to be persecuted and possibly even killed, and it's dangerous stuff. But there are people that do, every day there's great reporting done in Russia, and unfortunately, it's in Russian, so Americans, it's unfortunate for Americans, not for Russians, obviously, but it's a barrier. There's a language barrier, so I understand why Americans just assume that given what they can see is Vladimir Putin sound bites and Margarita Simonyan from RT spouting some kind of patriotic nonsense. That's all they see. That's all they know. But there are some great Russian journalists out there, and I mean, partly that's my job at Meduza is to translate what the journalists at Meduza do, and then also aggregate what all the other best Russian journalists are doing, and I think that's kind of my message to my fellow Americans.
Somewhat similar, and that is, it's not. I think the overfocus on Putin does a major disservice to all of us, in the American press in particular. I had a journalist tell me once that if he wanted to write a British guy who was working as a foreign correspondent in Russia, if he wanted to write about the weather, he would have to make it about Putin for his paper to publish it. And that's the problem, because what we lose when there's this focus on this one guy is that there are a whole bunch of other competing political forces, that there's politics in Russia in general. It's not the same as ours, but it's just different. It's a very complex place. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional country. It's a very large country, as everyone knows, but just think of how to govern a place that has 11 time zones, and one that is so centralized as Russia. And also the fact that Putin is a representative of an elite, of a class, that his foreign policy positions aren't just what he pulls out of his own head, but are linked and based and nurtured by foreign policy establishment in Russia. So I think for us to really try to deal with that country, we have to remember that in many respects it's just a normal place, in the sense that it's complex, it has differences than ours, and we have to understand those differences and those complexities. And one of the things that drives me completely crazy with I think hysteria is a good example is a good word, is that everything is reduced. Everything, and this is one of my kicks recently. Everything is reduced. Americans' views of Russia is based in a certain narcissism. That our whole understanding of Russia is about ourselves, and because of that, we miss a whole lot of potential commonalities that need to be nurtured.
Great. Like the different perspectives, and I definitely echo a lot of these, these perspectives, especially when it comes to that, not only the narcissism thing, but sort of the overemphasis, the personalization of Putin and Putin politics in the United States, and recognizing that there is quite a bit more, that it is a vibrant country, it is a very interesting country, and the political dynamics are certainly different from what we would expect to have in the United States, but it doesn't mean that it's all completely dominated by one totalitarian dictator, and everybody falls in line. In fact, there's quite a bit more to it. I guess again, trying to probe a little bit deeper on these questions of potential electoral interference between Russia and the United States. There's been a lot in the news, obviously a lot of ongoing investigations as to potential avenues. You've had the Mueller team has come out and sanctioned 13 Russian, or at least indicted, I should say, 13 Russian individuals and
the Treasury sanctions them later, though.
Yeah, and so following up with that, so this is obviously a big issue in terms of American domestic politics and Russian politics kind of coming into increasing conversation with one another there. So I'm curious as to what our panelists think about the dynamics of these particular cases, right? In terms of Russian hacking, as it were. Do you see this being, I guess, to piggyback on our last discussion, is this something that has been handed down from on high from Putin, or is there some greater degree of complexity that we need to know about when it comes to these headlines that we're seeing about Russian intervention in our elections?
Well, I kind of have a follow-up question for you, Hank, because my understanding, and maybe what I'd love is clarification to the degree that you can give it, that the hacking at least required such resources that the assumption is that it was indeed connected to some kind of, you know, government office. That's why they assume, you know, FSB, GRU, SVR, something like that.
Yes.
And like why, how do they know that kind of thing exactly?
So essentially the way that these types of attacks are attributed is based on some sort of obvious signs, but the more obvious signs tend to be things that could be false flags. So we try to look at some more subtle clues to determine where these attacks are actually coming from. One thing that is used in a lot of forensic analysis is just looking at basically the software that was run on particular machines. You know, because whoever has written this software, there's lots of different ways to sort of put together a tool chain of commands to get these sort of breaches accomplished. And looking at those tool chains and seeing where they show up in different places, because if it's the same person, they tend to use their stuff, the stuff that they've written, the stuff that they know works. And so being able to sort of identify that, well, this toolkit looks similar to something that was used, you know, in Ukraine, or it's used somewhere else where it was known that Russia was trying to interfere or tamper with technological systems, is one big sort of indicator. At the end of the day, you hear all these funny names in the news in terms of who's doing the hacking. It's what I'm trying to remember some of them. There's something Fuzzy Bear or something like that.
Fuzzy Bear,
I mean, they're essentially personas because we don't know who it really is. It's just sort of a persona that we've built up around these telltale indicators of a certain attacker's style.
Mm-hmm.
From your knowledge with computer science, like what degree of difficulty or knowledge in computer science does it take to actually do something like this? Like, does it actually take somebody that is in the government that's worked with computers their entire life? Like, how hard is it?
So to sort of execute this, the breadth of different techniques and breaches that we've seen requires a pretty sophisticated attacker. There are ways to do this a little more simply, but the problem is that the simple ways tend to attract more attention. So they're going to be much more easy to detect and block. Whereas it's sort of indicative of a skilled attacker if they're able to breach a large number of systems without being detected and sort of communicate back to what we call command and control servers, which is essentially communicating information back to whoever's executing the attack. To be able to do that in a sort of subtle, hidden way is a very, very challenging thing. So the fact that so many different machines were able to be successfully breached and are showing, you know, these similar tool chains or similar use of different software packages is indicative that we're dealing with a pretty sophisticated attacker.
Other questions?
There was an article last week that came out about the attacks on like the energy sources throughout America. Now, would that be a separate, I guess, individual doing that than would be the elections, or would they all come in generally the same way?
So the analyses that I have read show that sort of the technological forensics associated with those attacks is different from, for example, the attacks on the DNC network. There's, I think, Dragonfly is the persona that's being discussed in connection with the electrical grid attacks, and there's a really good Symantec blog post about that was actually released last year, but it's following the typical computer forensic techniques. It looks like sort of a different signature than the ones we saw associated with election tampering.
To the question of like how, where are the orders coming from? Now I can't really speak to the hacking stuff, but the troll stuff at least is usually attributed to the Internet Research Agency and its various reincarnations, and that goes back to Yevgeny Precoercion, who is usually called Putin's favorite chef, although he's actually a restaurateur, and he occasionally hosts Putin for his birthday. But really, what makes him Putin's favorite, it's a euphemism, because what the reference is to the fact that Prigozhin's business, this Concord catering empire, essentially, has billions of dollars in government contracts with the defense ministry and also with the Moscow school district, I believe. And so the idea there is usually that money, he's taking some money from all these contracts and, you know, with a nod and a wink, funneling a bit of it to the troll factory, and that it's all kind of happening with Putin's, you know, knowledge or maybe even instruction. I think that's kind of one end of the theorizing. And then the other interpretation that I'm probably a little bit more attracted to is the notion that Putin doesn't probably really have much idea what's going on with this. The hacking stuff, I would imagine he might be, there's more higher up involvement. It sounds more serious. But with the troll sort of stuff, it doesn't sound like Putin's wheelhouse at all. He's a guy who, to my understanding, doesn't really use email, let alone, you know how to steal identities on Facebook and do, you know, disaggregated content or whatever. The other thing, so why would Prigozhin then need to do this if he's not getting instructions from Putin? Well, the idea there is that he's signaling essentially his loyalty to the regime. And Putin maybe will then hear about it and just know that he's doing the right thing, or more likely, one of the functionaries in charge of domestic policy within the Kremlin is aware it's happening, and that's good, and so he'll stay in the good graces of this person and that person. I will note that Prigozhin has encountered troubles occasionally with police in St. Petersburg. They famously pulled over his motorcade once and ripped the siren, the migalka, right out of the car. And I think they temporarily arrested one of his drivers for being rude, but they kind of manhandled him, so to speak. It was clearly somebody sending a message saying, you know, cool your jets. And there was a report, I think in the last month, that said that his contracts with the defense ministry have been basically getting cut in half every year for the last 2 or 3 years. So all the more reason, perhaps, that he would need to signal, if not maybe it's not loyalty so much as a cry for help, along with some loyalty. But don't worry for him, by the way. He's doing just fine. Yeah. He's got billions of dollars. But this is just to the point of kind of, I guess it's dogs fighting under the rug. But that's always something to bear in mind when trying to wonder how involved is Putin, what's going on beneath him.
I thought it was interesting, just as an aside, when the announcement of the Mueller findings and whatnot came out, and Prigozhin was at the top of the list. Within a few hours, the New York Times put out a really insightful analysis of Prigozhin, and all of it was essentially drawn straight from Meduza sources. And it seemed like they were drawing on your own previous research into that. So I found that really kind of fascinating in that way. So
they added a hyperlink.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was nice.
The only thing I'll add to that is I think, clearly, this is the norm now. I think we could safely expect these kinds of shenanigans going on either continually or when there is an election, this kind of social media stuff. So then the question, for me is then, so what do we do about that? And a lot of what we do about that has little to do with Russia in particular. I think that's the conversation that's actually worth having in the sense of, how does this actually, what role does social media play in our political culture? Because one of the things that really strikes me about a lot of the media discourse about Russia, Facebook stuff, hacking, whatever, the way it's put as undermining our democratic institutions, undermining our democracy. Well, if the Russians can undermine our democracy, then we really have a problem with our democracy. Then there's really, something fundamentally weak about our democratic institutions if a couple of, weirdo Facebook posts of Bernie Sanders or something is undermining our democracy and our democratic institutions. We're really in trouble. And I think that that's what we need to address, considering that I think that this kind of stuff is the norm.
Do we have some questions from the audience? Taylor?
Know how regular civilians in Russia feel about
Just to clarify, I don't know if you can hear for the thing. The question was about the degree to which individual, I guess, Russian civilians are knowledgeable about the hacking and what their opinions are of the hacking in the United States.
It's not major news. It's kind of funny because for the last forever, the United States has been a regular feature in Russian news stories. The Russians know so much more about Americans than Americans do about Russia, and that's because they're looking to the United States all the time. Now, in the 90s, perhaps it was wistfully, and for the last 18 years, it's been increasingly hostile, and the reports have maybe mirrored Soviet journalism better, where it's like, let's go find American poverty and talk about America's foreign adventurism and so on. But the point is that they are thinking about the United States far more often, at least up until recently maybe, that Americans were thinking about Russians. And so one of the ironies is that with all of this Russia stuff in America's news cycle, as somebody who tracks the Russian news cycle and tries to find the things happening in Russian journalism that would be of interest to Americans, the hard thing for me is the realization that they're not really writing about this that much. They don't seem to care, and this is true across the board. The state media, you might say, oh, they're omitting it because it makes them look bad, although it really doesn't make them look bad. It makes them look all powerful. So
Right.
maybe they cover it to some degree, and as a story of spreading Russophobia, and we should all be frightened by the panicked Americans. But the independent journalists, they've done some investigative reporting on, like I mentioned before, Precoercion's troll factory, his mercenaries. I'm probably forgetting, but there are investigative stories about issues that are of interest to Americans. But the hacking and the trolls are treated, I think, more as a joke than anything. I don't think that's necessarily because they're so informed about it. I mean, quite the opposite. They don't really have the information because it's not something that Russian journalists have deemed all that interesting. Or they've deemed it an American issue. And so it's just not something that's reported on regularly in Russian the way it is in English in the United States. So I would say that they don't care that much. And it's partly because their journalists don't care that much. But I think that the journalists are responding to what they perceive to be is a lack of interest in this subject.
I think there's also a little bit of sort of this assertion that Americans messed up, and now they're just looking for a scapegoat.
Yeah.
And they've always kicked us when we're down, and so they're just looking for, we're just going to blame all of our problems on Russia, and that's kind of consistent with we do that from time to time.
A lot of independent Russian journalists have actually been quite disgusted by the American response, in the American media specifically. And there have been several prominent, I don't know if it's fair to call them opposition columnists or whatever, but I mean, like, people that are generally independent-minded have written, pretty popular columns basically saying how ashamed they are that they used to hold up American media as a model, and now they find out that when push comes to shove, they're just as nationalistic and xenophobic and frightened as the most loyal Kremlin reporters or something like that. And Oleg Kashin put out an op-ed that made this point, and Masha Gessen, whom you could read in English, writes to this effect, often in the New Yorker, and she's generally trying to pour cold water on the sentiment that Russia swung the election, and the gist of her arguments is often, look to yourselves, and there is a problem, but it's here at home, and I think that the fact that Americans aren't doing more of that is upsetting to Russians because they see it as the same sort of mentality that their adversaries in the sort of pro-government media often exhibit.
I'd like to ask Dr. Carter if you're 100% confident that in coming at the midterm elections that our voting machines are completely safe?
100% is very absolute. I would have a hard time saying,
And if not, why not?
with absolute certainty, that I'm confident in security. However, when we're talking about voting machines in particular, there's this word hacking gets thrown around a lot in terms of, what the Russians are doing and where they're doing it. And I think it's important to note that there has been no evidence that voting machines themselves or voting counts were modified. And there's also been no evidence that voter rolls were modified. It seems like some voter rolls were stolen. So it's, that information was leaked, but it wasn't tampered with to anyone's knowledge who has actually examined the evidence. So to address going forward as far as security, there's a lot of different pieces essentially that would need to be broken to affect any sort of wide-scale change or effect on an election outcome. A lot of these election machines, or most of the voting machines, are not connected to networks. While they are very old, in some ways that's sort of a perk because you have to have very specific knowledge of these old machines to know how to break into them. They're also very diverse. There's different models, different brands, different styles from precinct to precinct. So while there is a concern in terms of security of individual machines and devices that I think needs to be remedied if we're going to have faith in our electoral system, to actually successfully do this on more than a one-off sort of attack would be very, very difficult.
Other questions?
I just want to know why they're making this attempt at all. I mean, what's the goal here? I mean, really? I mean, is it all about nothing, or do you know?
Well, I think this might be a little more politically motivated than technologically.
Why not? They
Yeah.
can. I mean, why interfere in the American election? Well, because they could. I mean, I'm sorry for such a flippant answer, but they could. And I think in particular, they wanted to kind of pour water or pee or whatever on the American democracy, because on the one hand, I think there is a personal element to the fact that Clinton was running. Putin said that when she was when she was Secretary of State, that the protests in 2011 were organized by the U.S. State Department. Whether he actually believes that or not, I don't know, but that's what he said. Hillary Clinton, basically called him similar to Hitler, which, for any Russian who grew up in post-war Russia, to that I would imagine is incredibly offensive. There is the role of her husband in 1990s Russia with Boris Yeltsin. There's a lot of reasons, I think, for Putin to, or the Russian government or Putin personally to have problems with Hillary Clinton. Also, the feeling that with Hillary Clinton, they knew they were going to get a more hawkish position vis-a-vis Russia if she was elected president. So I think any way to kind of muck up her election, her prospects, her mandate was in the works. I don't think that they specifically wanted Donald Trump elected because now they're still dealing with this now. They don't know what to make of him. He's too unpredictable. And the Russian government, if anything, likes predictability. So I think they were surprised, as I think the whole world was, that she was not elected. But yeah, a lot of it is just because, and also the other thing I suspect, this is just my feeling, is that the American government lectures Russia about their political system all the time. So this is a way to kind of throw it back, right?
The technological evidence sort of supports that because there are fingers in lots of pies, right? They're probing to see what sorts of infrastructure systems they can get into, whether it's water systems, electrical systems, power plants. They're probing voting machine manufacturers. There's the whole troll farm thing, which, based on what was actually sort of traced back to these troll farms, it's not clear that they were supporting Trump because they liked him. It's just sort of opportunistic. Like they were going to back someone to stir the pot, and when it looked like he might be the most promising person, then that's where they sort of put their energy.
I think it's also, there was a really great investigative report by a Meduza journalist named Daniil Turovsky, who did this enormously deep dive into Russia's own cybersecurity infrastructure And he's done subsequent reporting on how the Russian government, manages its cybersecurity. And one of its most effective, or one of its most relied upon resources are criminals. And so they basically make these pacts with these cyber criminals to say that, basically telling them, do your dirty business everywhere but in Russia, and we're going to occasionally need your help with some things. And so you get, the reason that that maybe Russia's cyber posture is prone to this sort of bizarre kind of petty, semi-criminal kind of poking around could be that a lot of the kind of foot soldiers in their, it's not always the military, but in their establishment are themselves criminals, and when they're not doing this, they're raiding banks for cash and things like that.
Other questions? Yes.
This is for Dr. Carter. I was actually at a talk at the law school and as a panel for cybersecurity, and they foresaw the escalation of these troll factories and disinformation as it was going to result in more and more sanctions. Do you think there's any chance that there'll be a technical solution to the problem, or do you think it's going to continue being more political?
Facebook's going to go out of business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's with their sort of mismanagement of data, it's looking more likely. So the technical solution is very, very difficult to achieve because, computers they're very good at statistics, they're very good at a lot of things, but they're very bad at sort of interpreting meaning and attribution for things that are written in, English or, some language text. So coming up with sort of an automated solution to try to vet information that shows up on social media networks is a really challenging problem, and it probably is in the near-term future going to lead to more accusations of sort of censorship and error than it's going to actually help things. So maybe many decades down the road we'll have a solution, but at least in the short term, that's going to be a tough challenge for a while. Yes?
Does the United States have enough technical capability to do the same thing on Russia that they're doing to us? Or at least since they don't really have a democracy and a political system, at least get to some of their infrastructure?
We definitely have plenty of technological capability. And, this is, I think, just like their hacking of our systems is not talked about very much over there, our sort of international operations are not talked about very much here. And I'm not in government, so I can't speak to details, but we know from certain information leaks that, yes, U.S. intelligence is active in probing and trying to attack computer systems in other foreign countries, and they're very, very good at it.
And when it comes to political disruption, the Russians are already doing it to themselves.
Yeah.
In fact, the troll factory, their primary activities are domestic.
Yeah.
And so Prigozhin's, again, it's not only Prigozhin, but like the people that work, people like him and the people working for him, their activities are primarily focused inward, and it's more about, propping up the Kremlin and disorienting the opposition, and that's where they cut their teeth. Mm-hmm. And they kind of like dedicated, around election time, they shifted some of the resources to mess with the Americans, but they're focused primarily on maintaining disruption at home. And it's not just trolls, there's also networks of news organizations designed to circulate kind of pro-government reports about this intervention in Syria. And when it comes to managing information, what could America do that Russia isn't already doing to itself? I don't know. I don't think anything that we could do would of course, it would violate American principles, but also, even if we decided to just be Machiavellian, they're already doing everything. We could try to give the opposition the resources to do these things, but it doesn't. I don't think it works. I don't think it makes any sense. Although I will say that the conspiracy theories are that the opposition's already getting help from
Yeah,
from the
right,
Americans. Like
right.
Navalny, the kind of informal leader of the opposition, although many people in the opposition will tell you he's not their leader, is regularly accused of working for, if not the American government, then George Soros. He's getting money from somebody bad and resources, and that. How do you think he finances his whole anti-corruption foundation? It's all dirty money, and what's his job anyway? What do his taxes say?
And the Russians are already, I mean, American media, if you take it as it's just in it's a global empire. I mean, there already is a lot of American culture influencing Russian life. I mean, you can go watch all the same superhero movies in Russia that you do here. You can watch Game of Thrones in Russia, they do here. I mean, from their perspective, they think they're playing in a, they're small potatoes compared to the dominance or the influence of American media, American culture on Russia.
Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. How effective are U.S. sanctions on Russia?
Effectiveness of U.S. sanctions on Russia.
Well, so, I mean, I think the concern from people who are anti-sanctions is that there'll be a rally around the flag effect.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding, and I'm not a sociologist, but my understanding from surveys is that there kind of is and isn't, depending on the way you ask the question. I will say that I think in the last few weeks, I believe the Energy Ministry put out a report on Russia's new perspective on threats, national security threats in the energy sector. And front and center, number one, was the fact that the sanctions are cutting off the Russian energy industry's access to high technology and foreign capital.
Yeah.
And that's the sanctions. Yeah. Now, sure, yeah, if you add somebody's name to the list, they're going to wear it like a badge of honor because look at what a great patriot they are. The Americans don't like them.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to the bread and butter of Russia's might, the hydrocarbons industry, the sanctions do seem to be having an effect.
Yeah.
And the Energy Ministry has certainly taken note. And I do think that if you try and understand some of the hostility from the Kremlin, and all you see is a few names on a blacklist, doesn't seem to reconcile. Consider the impact of cutting off, Rosneft or Gazprom's access to things like drilling technology or the capital they need to start that next, refinement, what have you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my understanding as well. It's really the access because so for example, to tap into the Arctic oil reserves, that big deal they were supposed to have with Exxon, they need Exxon technology to do the drilling. And the capital, the foreign capital loans from foreign banks is also a major issue. So cutting off access to European banks is really important. I think the EU sanctions are more important than the American sanctions for that reason because Russia's economics as a country are more tied to Europe for obvious reasons. It's right there. Than, say, Russia's economic relationship with the United States. The thing with the sanctions, what is the point of them? The idea is not only to kind of strangle economically, but the hope is that if you put a bunch of these rich guys on the sanctions list and they can't, go park their money in Western banks or they have problems getting visas for their children to study in, big universities in the United States or in Europe, things like this, that somehow they'll turn against Putin, right? And then they'll somehow conspire to get rid of him. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Because first off, you can wear it as a badge of loyalty to, show your loyalty to the big guy upstairs who runs the country, but Russians are patriotic too, right? I mean, why wouldn't they?
It also seems like the sanctions aren't strong enough to actually achieve that.
And that's the other thing. They're not really, and I think the Russian economy now is only 30% hydrocarbons, if I remember the last statistic. So, I just actually saw, if you look, Russia is exporting more wheat than any country in the world. They're now a wheat exporter. And they're actually increasing wheat exports more and more and more. So there is some slow diversification, not as much as they need, but there is some.
Great. Other questions?
What's the poisoning all about? Can you talk about that? It seems like this.
I haven't been following it.
Okay.
I just haven't, not interested in it.
I mean, well, to connect it to the talk of sanctions, the British response so far has been basically to cut off high diplomatic contacts. They're not sending the royal family to the World Cup. And they expelled, I think, 23 diplomats. Today, I think they were forced, they left.
Yeah.
And so what they didn't do, which is what I know, I think Navalny himself
Yeah,
asked for this, and
right.
many in the opposition have, was to crack down on all the Russian assets, both real estate and financial, in London, and they didn't do that. And so I think the reaction was underwhelming, and it didn't help the British cause that today Trump called Putin and congratulated him on his re-election. And apparently didn't mention the poisoning.
Right.
Which is pretty unbelievable.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, the competing theories are, I mean, again, there's sort of a spectrum here. One is Putin picked up the phone and called the local, spy team that they have got on the ground there in Salisbury and said, get to it. And then the other end is that Putin has no idea what's going on, and either this is, some criminal,
Some rogue
or it's an actor within a government agency and he's lost control of them. It's somewhere in between those two things. Either way, I mean, that is to say, if it is indeed Russia, I'm not a nerve agent specialist, so the Russians are denying it. So maybe indeed it was Sweden. Which they've said that it could be Sweden, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Britain, or maybe the United States.
Because they're upset about not getting the World Cup.
These are all countries that they claim there's either evidence or that they possibly have the capability to have recreated the Novichok stuff, the agent that Theresa May says was used to poison Skripal and his daughter and everybody else that got near them. And so, yeah, it's. I mean, you can imagine under different American leadership, this would be a bigger scandal than it seems to be. But so far, the Brits seem like they're on their own. And from the Russian perspective, I will say that, and again, maybe they're exaggerating this because I mostly see the Russian perspective. They haven't gotten access to either the Skripals who are in hospital right now, or the samples that the British apparently have that they did the tests on. And I've also read that in order to verify the substance itself, you need to have some of it already. In which case, well, how did they have it? And that's where the Russians come in and say, okay, you have some too. The Russians have also denied even having any left, but there have been, I think today, 2 or 3 scientists who helped make it went on record in interviews and said, yeah, there's still a few dozen people in Russia that know how to manufacture this sort of thing. It was developed in the 70s and 80s as a Soviet response to VX. So maybe America's to blame in the end for making VX. But it's a very strange thing. It doesn't quite, the timing doesn't quite make sense. I mean, unless it was a gift to Putin, a pre-election gift. But in terms of, does the Kremlin need another international scandal right now ahead of the World Cup with Putin about to be gloriously reelected? It doesn't work at all in terms of timing.
Yeah, it's just a very weird case.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that the British response, like Kevin said, Navalny and many others were calling for basically, stop allowing Russian money into London. And that's really the problem. If you really want to hurt the Russian elite, then close their access off to offshore accounts, Western banks, all sorts of financial shenanigans and institutions. But they're not going to do that, right? Because we use those too to hide our money. At least our elite uses offshore accounts to hide their money too and to launder their money, and keep it, in tax shelters and things like this. So it kind of, they're playing their own game in an international system that many Western countries and Western elites use too. So this becomes one of the problems with all of this. I mean, take another interesting thing that I heard about, take this Paul Manafort guy who was charged with the violating the foreign agent law because he didn't register as an agent for working for the Ukrainians. I read somewhere that after he was indicted, all of these lobbyists all of a sudden now start registering as foreign agents. I mean, the funny thing about Manafort for me is that this guy's been doing this for 10 years, and all of a sudden now he's caught. Now, if there wasn't all of this stuff about, interference, election, possible collusion, he could have kept on doing this forever because, let's be honest, we have lobbyists who are working for the Saudi government. We have lobbyists who are working for the Israeli government and a whole bunch of other governments. So really, it's a structural problem, in my view, to deal with all of this stuff. It's kind of ironic. When I saw that Trump, a report about him, the press asking him about congratulating Putin for election, who was sitting next to him? The King of Saudi Arabia. What? I mean, what is this? Like, you're saying, why did he thank, the media is probably saying, look, he thanked Putin for his re-election. But here's the King of Saudi Arabia, an incredibly repressive state, sitting right next to him. So what is that? Stop with this. Let's be honest about what's going on here.
A lot of different standards. So it looks like we're about out of time, and I want to thank our panelists and for keeping on topic for more than it, and the questions from the audience. I was partially worried we would spend 75% of our time talking about Donald Trump rather than keeping on the topic of Russian internet politics. So.
Well, we know what went on here was a very substantial and at times delightfully wry presentation, and let us thank them.
Yeah.